Hopefully you had a chance to explore the big questions you're bringing into the room today. And we invite you to continue to bring those forward. Let's talk about them. Expectations for the day is we're probably going to have more questions than answers, and we all just need to be kind of okay with that. We're going to go ahead and get started. We'll do introductions here shortly, but a couple quick notes before we get moving. From a safety standpoint, take a moment to look around, identify your exits. In the event of an emergency, restrooms are out here in this hallway and on the other side of the elevator as well. We'll take breaks throughout the morning, but feel free to step out at any point if you need to. One quick note on microphones and then lunch. Don't let me forget lunch, most important. Okay, Paul is holding up a microphone. That's Paul back there. He's our tech support technology guru. There's microphones placed around the room. They have a red light on them, and if they're turned on, they'll have a green light. Green light. If they're on, everybody participating remotely can hear you, so just be mindful of what you say. It can be embarrassing sometimes. And as we participate in discussion and questions, we're going to ask that you turn your mic on so the group can hear you. Lunch is not provided. There is a cafe here in the building with lots of salads, wraps, what have you. If you want to avoid a lunch rush, we'd encourage you to go out and grab lunch before we dismiss everybody for eating. We're going to take about a 30-minute lunch break. Okay? What other announcements have I forgotten? Sticky notes, index cards.
Sticky notes are provided on the second table and the fourth table. We will have some activities today where the first and the third tables will turn around and work with them and use the sticky notes and note cards as instructed. In terms of emergency exits, you have right outside this hall the main exit, and if you were to go out this door here, you would take a right down to the end of the hall, take another right, and there's staircase 1, and that will lead you out of the building.
You did a lot better with the safety announcement than I did. Nice job, Austin. Okay, last note, we are recording this webinar again, so just be mindful of what you're saying near microphones. It will be preserved for all of eternity. So before we get started, we're going to do a quick poll of who is here in the room. We're not going to do individual introductions because we want to get things moving, but by group. Utilities. Do we have utilities in the room? Welcome. Thanks for joining us. Okay, building owners. Anybody own a building? All right, welcome. Associations? Groups? Yeah, great, welcome. Program administrators? Okay, local, state government? Welcome. Architects, engineers, designers? Good. Who'd I miss? Amy, who are you? Public interest, welcome. Good to see you, Amy. Okay, so let's go ahead and get rolling. I'm going to do a quick review of the agenda and then we'll introduce a few folks here in the room. So today we're going to be spending just under 4 hours together. We're going to do an overview of ASHRAE sections 5 and 6 today. Chuck is going to guide us through a presentation, and then we'll have some activities workshop to do following that. We'll take about 30 minutes for a lunch break, and then we've got the City of Seattle here to give us a presentation right after lunch. And then we're going to spend some time doing workshop and discussion. We're really looking to harvest ideas that you all have about what topics are most important and in what order should we be talking about them. So that's how we're going to move through the day. Any notes on agenda? Arrow should be doing things, right? Okay, great. All right, team commerce. We are here with a talented team of folks that are really excited to be here today, get to know you all, and have quite a bit of discussion. My name is Emily Salzberg. I'm a managing director in the State Energy Office, and my primary charge right now is working closely with Chuck Murray on standing up the Clean Buildings package, in addition to working on the state energy strategy. We also have here in the room Chuck Murray. Chuck, here's Chuck. You're going to hear a lot from Chuck today. Okay, and then we have Austin. Here is our Energy Rules and Legislative Coordinator. Recent addition to the State Energy Office, and we're thrilled to have him here today. Paul Currington in the back, again, as tech support and all-around great guy. We are supported by a huge cast of characters, and I mean that as a compliment, that are going to be helping us move through standing up the clean buildings package and really getting this work off and moving. We'll talk a little bit more about that here shortly. Just a quick note, many of you know, if you're here, you probably have already landed on it, is the buildings webpage on Commerce's website. This is your go-to place for information as it becomes available. We've been doing our best to keep information up to date and current on workshops, webinars, content, and all kinds of important stuff. We do have an email address, buildings@commerce.wa.gov. That's the best way to get a response if you've got a question or have a note that you want to send our way. It lands in all of our inboxes, and so we will aim to respond promptly to that. All right, we have a team of wonderful people working with us. We're partnering closely with the WSU Energy Program that's going to be working with us in a number of different capacities. We've got David, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, Karen Janowitz, who is here in the room, and Jake, who is here in the room. Thanks for joining us. We also have contracted with an organization called SBW, who's going to be doing work with us to help identify our energy use intensity targets for the purposes of this legislation. Faith, thanks for joining us. Do you want to give a quick wave? There's Faith. All right, so before we lean too far into the conversation, we thought it would be helpful to really ground ourselves in the intent of what we're trying to accomplish. This is stated in RCW and also was included in House Bill 1257. So in developing energy performance standards, the department, which is Commerce, shall seek to maximize reductions of greenhouse gas emissions from the building sector. Our conversations inevitably are going to go down rabbit holes and at times probably get a little contentious. So we're going to continue to remind ourselves of what our charge is. Chuck, anything else you want to say about that? All right, Clean Buildings webpage. I already talked about this a little bit, but this is your go-to for agendas, meeting minutes, recordings, presentations, and draft rules. As we move through our workshops, we will get better at posting information in a more timely fashion. All right, linked from the webpage, we've got session law, we've got RCWs. We do have a link to the read-only version of ASHRAE Standard 100. That can be really helpful. We've gotten that question a number of times. That's your link to be able to view a read-only copy of ASHRAE Standard 100, and a link to Energy Star Portfolio Manager. So it's a great resources listed on those webpage. Here's a list of the RCWs that are in place now that we've got legislation that is passed. So if you need those, real quickly, I'm going to walk through the schedule that we have in front of us here over the next year. So ultimately, what we're looking at and really aware of right now is we have to have rules completed by November 1st of 2020. So that is just shy of a year away. We filed our CR 101, which is a form you file with the Code Revisor's Office to get rulemaking up and running. We did that early on in the fall. We're going to be working through a series of workshops to get input from you all to help shape how we should approach the work ahead of us. We're going to be working in the winter of 19 and 20, developing the methodology that we have, setting draft targets, and getting input on draft rules. We're going to be leaning heavily on SBW for that work, so thanks so much ahead of time, Faith. Moving into the spring of 2020, there's a phone number on there. I wonder whose phone number that is. Where'd that come from? That's a surprise. Okay, spring of 2020, we are going to do additional workshops, get more input, and we're going to be filing what's called our CR 102 form. Again, this is with the Code Revisor's Office, and it's just a step in the process of doing rulemaking. Summer of 2020, we're going to be having public hearings, and we're going to be finalizing the rules. And then fall of 2020, we'll be publishing the 103 form, which is final rules, with the target of November 1st of 2020. Here's a list of the workshops that we have planned right now. This is posted on the building's webpage. They are subject to change, but this will give you a sense. We've got a bunch of meetings, conversations that we've got queued up for November and December, and we welcome, invite, and encourage you all to attend. We're going to be here at the Smart Building Center for every one of those meetings. If you've got input, if that's not working for you, we'd love to hear that. Seattle seemed like a really nice central location, though, to gather. So big thanks to the Smart Building Center for having us here. I should have started the day with that. Chuck. It's your turn, Chuck. So thank you, everybody, for joining us.
One quick technical note, you may see comments appearing up here. This is an exchange between our guests who are online and Paul. It says Glenn Blackman when it says that. There are things you guys don't need to pay attention to, but you will notice them up there, and we'll work on that going forward. If you have any concerns about that or any questions, I will send you to Glenn Blackman. If you know him, you can send complaints to him. So.
That'll be interesting. Um, so hi, I'm Chuck Murray. I'm an energy policy specialist at the Department of Commerce. I've been doing building efficiency work at the department for a dozen years and in state government for 28 years, probably. You lose count somewhere. Today, we're going to go through a number of subjects. I might as well just get us started. First of all, how many people watched the webinar, was live on the webinar? Did anybody, well, better question, hasn't looked at the webinar yet, or our introductory meeting? Okay, don't feel bad, but understand that there's a lot of content there that'll kind of catch you up with where we're starting today. I'm going to repeat a few things here to get us all in the room together, but mostly we're going to start with some new subjects. First of all, I'm going to call out here on this first slide the primary rulemaking subjects as I read them in the statute. Generally speaking, we adopt ASHRAE Standard 100 and we modify it as specified by the legislation. And the legislation says that we're to set Washington-specific EUI targets for select building types. That's work that's going to go on over a number of months here. We need to adopt a specific life cycle cost methodology. It was also, what is in the standard is not what we'll be using. We're going to develop one specific legislation that we adopted. And then we need to adopt administrative procedures. ASHRAE Standard 100 gives you all the instructions on the technical subjects, but they don't really tell you how to administer it as a law, as well as it probably should. We think that's a good part of the work. And we're going to have to do it both for the mandatory standard, which doesn't kick in until 2026, but also for this early adopter incentive program we'll be developing that will begin in July of 2020. And then, you know, we have to develop procedures for incentive payments. That's largely going to be a conversation between Commerce and the utilities. Of course, we want to make sure that the participating building owners get paid if they the early adopter program, but I think most of the work on the rulemaking will be amongst the utility Commerce. And we'll have some special meetings to work on that. So the law, RCW 1927A 210 makes direct reference to the adoption of Standard 100. We're adopting this much like folks that are familiar with adopting the building code. We start with the International Building Code and we go through and modify it. That's largely how our process is going to work. Well, there will be some stuff outside of that, but a lot of the work will be done in the context of the standard. The standard also references other documents, and I've posted a few of those up there. It directly references the Commercial Building Energy Audit Protocol. So I think it's incorporated by reference. And there are other things that are just informative background pieces that are also referenced in the standard. So as you read through the standard, you also have to pay attention to the references. I'm going to say a thing about ASHRAE format. ASHRAE has included a good number of annexes, they're appendices really. And there are informative and normative. Formative means just that, it's reference material to help you get your job done. Normative is actually a requirement of the standard. So when you look through all the annexes at the back of the standard, or they're part of supplementing the standard, keep those two in mind. Just a little bit about the layout and who's impacted by the standard. Compliance requirements are outlined in section 4 of the standard. And we'll highlight a few of those today. But the actual directions on what you do in response to those instructions are in the following chapters. And all buildings that are in our cohort, the buildings, non-residential buildings over 50,000 square feet, are required to do sections 5, 6, and 7. And then the cohort which are above the EUI targets, that's BTUs per square foot per year, are required to do additional work, which includes energy audit requirements, implementation of energy efficiency measures, and Paul distracted me, I think, because he has a question.
I just want to know when is a good time to ask questions from the people online.
Why don't I pause and Paul, perhaps you could pick a couple for now.
Okay, I do have two. I just wanted to know when would.
Yeah, let's go ahead and answer a couple of questions.
Okay, well, I hope this is an appropriate time. This is from Nancy Goddard, and she has two questions. I'll do the second one first. Pacific Power serves quite a few controlled atmosphere fruit storage facilities in the Yakima area. If these buildings are required to comply, will there be a specific EUI target set for them? That's question one.
And I think the answer for that is yes. The standard currently defines warehouse and refrigerated warehouse. Now, those atmospheric might be unique in another way, and we'll have to figure that out.
Okay, question two. You might want to, well, I'd like more info on in exception/industrial, which buildings that meet the size requirement but are not required to comply.
There are specific exceptions for buildings constructed as industrial facilities as defined by your building code. Those folks get to just exempt the building. Process loads are exempt in all buildings. So we're going to have to figure out how to exclude those as part of our process. That was a little more detailed than I was ready for. Okay, she's on it. All right, any questions from the audience yet? All right, they're all waiting for the next conversation. So just to finish up, sorry I got distracted there. So for buildings that exceed our EUI targets, you have to go through a process of energy audits and implementation. The implementation requirements are either you develop a package of efficiency measures sufficient to bring your building within the target, or you develop and adopt what I've referenced here as all cost-effective measures, whether you hit the target or not. And one of our rulemaking jobs here is to come to an agreement on how we calculate and demonstrate that cost effectiveness test. So that was my 4 slides to catch you up with a 40-minute webinar that we already had. If you need more info, I suggest you go back and review that. I'm going to start diving into some things I pulled out of the standard that I think folks are going to want to comment on. And I'm going to start with the cast of characters. Within the standard, there are many different characters that are identified in the definitions section of the standard. They all are called out as having different roles in the context of the standard. And so I think making sure we get this right is important. Now, I don't see us changing any of these definitions, but we may want to make reference to some of our local talent. BOC isn't mentioned, for example. They probably have a spot here, BOC certified people. There are probably specific commissioning authorities that would like to be recognized. So at any rate, as we go through this, I think folks are going to want to make comment on that. But once again, as you're reading through the standard, find a new person that you don't know what they're supposed to do, it's in the definition. Here's a couple that we'll be talking about today. I think these are fairly broad and definitions. I'm not going to read them in detail right now. But here's an example where there are kind of multiple qualifications allowed, where we might want to recognize some of our local talent. And I welcome those comments, forward. So section 4, once again, outlines what the compliance requirements for the standard are. And today we're going to acknowledge and look at 2 of them, which are the operations and maintenance requirements, which are at section 6 of the standard, and the energy management planning that are in section 5. And I'm going to make a request that people think about these things, not just in the context of what they ask you to do, but in the context of how we're going to administer this moving forward. Again, the standard isn't as specific about the administrative features as probably like it to be. What I've referenced here are the RCWs, asking the department to develop administration, as well as it's also part of Standard 100. So diving in. Section 5 establishes your energy management plan. This is the building owner's work. Likely they're going to designate an energy manager to do this work. And I'm just going to highlight what the standard says. There's details in addition to what I'm putting on the screen here, but this is basically, I've chopped out the energy accounting system. This is, establish your building's energy utilization index. Make sure you're up to date for the current year. You You need to update it annually. You need to create a target specific for your own building. Every building's possibly going to have a somewhat different target simply because if it's a mixed-use facility, your target is built up of area-weighted EUIs. I think the one here I want to draw attention to is the dot 5 here. Building occupancy changes over time, schedules change over time. The energy manager's job is to keep that up to date. So that when you're creating your EUI and your target that relates to the EUI, it actually reflects what's going on in the building at the time you establish that number. And then, the energy manager also tracks, the work that's going on in the building if energy efficiency measures are adopted. So this gives you an idea what the energy manager's up to. These are documentation requirements of the standard that every building owner is going to need to keep up with. And here's a few additional things, keep up with your audit reports, understand the list of possible efficiency measures that have been implemented. It also requires building owners to have an information system for occupants. So, communicating energy conservation at the occupant activity levels, part of this. Training plan for the O&M personnel, capital management plan, and there's some other things. So I've just rattled off a whole bunch of stuff that has to be in the energy management plan. I haven't detailed it here today, but I'm just bringing to the point, it's incumbent on a building to have an energy management system in place and an assigned person that we know that's the person to talk to about this. So do the occupants of the building. Sure. Sure. I'm going to repeat the question because we didn't get a hot mic from you. But we could, oh, you want to go for it? Okay.
So the question is simply, a capital management plan may mean something different to a building owner who's thinking about their revenues and expenses and capital plan than a energy manager. So the question is capital management plan defined in the statute? And if not, are you planning on defining it?
I just cut part of the section .10 there, and I'm sure it gives you more description of what that means. Karen has pulled it up for us.
I can read it. 51210, a capital management plan identifying equipment for replacement with energy efficient and Energy Star rated equipment in case of failure. But I think it might change a little bit. That was just the Energy Star part, but basically that's it.
Yeah. So it's your equipment replacement plan. Without reading a little further. All these, there's more to it. I'd encouraging everybody to go look at it. So your annual completion is that the energy manager keep this plan up to date. Going to inform the building occupants that the plan exists and is available. Building owner has to review and sign the plan every. So they're acknowledging that that work has been. Well, that's part of our discussion. And you know, I started this whole thing with a question, what are our administrative structures? And, well, I'll go ahead and riff on that a little right now. We need administrative structures that are detailed enough that Commerce have assurance the work's getting done and it's getting done with a level of competency. I also think that building owners want to be able to be assured that they know that they've done what's required and they're finished. So having some structure that, where they know they've gone through the process and they've completed the process, I think is an important part of this. With those kind of two bookends in mind, you know, nobody wants too much paperwork. Everybody needs enough to make sure that things have happened according to the standard. We need to find that sweet spot. That is our administrative challenge.
We have an administrative question here from Jeff Trujillo on the Section 5 requirement for energy accounting system. Is Energy Star Portfolio Manager considered adequate for this purpose?
I think that is a likely conclusion, but we're going to have to work our way through that. I think it's a very likely conclusion, but let's not jump to the end yet.
I have a question on the energy management plan. Do you see that form or maybe like a portal that building owners would log
Yes.
into and report, or
Yes.
both? Okay.
We're going to try and make this as so that data can be shared as easily as possible. That's all part of the work we're going to do. This afternoon, part of what we're going to be doing is seeing how Seattle has managed their building tune-up program and the kinds of forms they've used and the portals they've developed. Those are just examples for us to consider as we develop our rules and our administrative procedures. So the coming up partially on the answer to the question we just had about Energy Star. The other part of Section 5 is the building energy monitoring rule set. This basically tells you how to track energy use in your building. It is a little different than Energy Star, but very similar. This is their diagram of how to calculate net energy use in a facility. I put down there AKA benchmarking. This is very much like the benchmarking you're used to in Energy Star Portfolio Manager. Grab a mic.
Will this require campuses to add meters to unmetered buildings?
I believe that will be the simplest solution for most campus buildings. However, we are open to alternative methodologies for that because it's a difficult problem. So, you know, our energy auditing. So okay, here's another rule that I probably should have mentioned earlier. Well, that's actually in. So, well, first of all buildings have to report their EUI. So if it's not metered, how are we going to do that? Very good question. I think that the state government, for example, is going to step up and all their bigger buildings extent, but I'm not sure that it'll be 100%. And so we need an alternate method. And I'm going to try and talk to folks that have campuses where they have a good number of large buildings that aren't metered. Try and come up with a methodology to calculate those. does need to be a calculation that's robust enough to cover each building, though. I don't want to see a campus averaging thing going on the way we have in the past, because that is just not up to the nature of this type of work. Sure.
A sub question on that too. I know with certain campus customers we work with, oftentimes they may have steam, and that can be particularly challenging to meter at a building level at an accurate way. So I think it's a, table item, but that's, yeah, there's a whole process to maybe discuss or work
And I
out on
think
that.
we're gonna get a group of those folks together, and as well as some talented engineers, and sit down and see if we can figure something out that works. Now, there are, within the standard, if you can't make an EUI for your building, you're automatically moved into section 8 and 9 of the standard. So folks that cannot find the EUI be doing energy audit. So folks are going to be motivated to solve those problems. So once again, basically section 5.2 provides a group of instructions on how you would benchmark a building. I think we're going to be motivated to change the standard and adopt Energy Star Portfolio Manager. We welcome comments on that. We welcome people looking at both what's in Standard 100 and Energy Star and seeing if there's any crosswalk work we need to do. But I think generally speaking, we'll go to this Energy Star Portfolio Manager. And I think it's largely because we have an existing law that says we're supposed to be doing that already. We've set up systems with utilities to get that work done. So while it's not a foregone conclusion, I think it's highly likely that's where we end up.
So this is Nicholas Garcia with Waputo. Several of the utilities I work with are very rural, and they may have 1 or 2 buildings in their entire county that meet this requirement. So the question I have is, it's one thing to say that a place like King County and buildings there need to use an Energy Star Manager. I'm making a presumption that there are probably, excuse me, several that are available that you could go to. But if you're in a very rural county where there just isn't that service available, is there going to be an alternative provided?
Well, so what you're talking about is the data transfer from the utility to the customer, where they aggregate the multiple meters that might be on site, create a benchmarking report for the customer. And for the largest utilities, they're required for every building over 10,000 square feet automatically upload that to Portfolio Manager. According to this law from 2009. For the smaller utilities, I think it's under 25,000 customers, they can use Portfolio Manager's Excel spreadsheet version, which is a version that folks can upload Energy Star Portfolio Manager. So that's the way the law is written. We did make some revisions to clarify that for folks in the last, in House Bill 1257. And we can workshop that a little if folks need more information on that.
So if I could just follow up, I'm not just trying to be argumentative. I'm just saying that there are places in rural Washington that's going to be very difficult to comply simply because the people who have any knowledge of this don't live there, don't exist there. And so you might want to think a little bit about the implementation and how it's going to work in those sorts of areas as well.
Certainly.
talk for just a minute. Nicholas, thank you for the question. I think that's a really important one, is how can we create systems and capacity to help the communities that are going to need help with complying with this? We welcome your input. I'm sure you have great ideas on how we can do that, and that will be part of our process, is to really glean those ideas from you all and see what we can do to structure those support systems available. One of the key roles of the WSU Energy Program is going to be providing customer support. From a technical standpoint, from a logistical administrative compliance standpoint, et cetera. So Karen Janowitz and Jake are here in the room. They would love to hear more from you, as would Chuck and I. So more discussion on that, point well taken, and we will be building that into the process. So not a perfect answer, but we hear you. Okay. Where'd Chuck go? Behind me.
Paul, how we doing online? Oh, Paul left. Okay. All right, no questions online. So that was a very big, fast overview of Section 5. I recommend folks go read it, read the details. Think of more detailed questions you'll have for us in the future on those sections. And in particular, commentary on that balance of administration versus making some assurance that quality work's being done without overly burdening this administrative process. The next piece of work is the operation and maintenance requirements. This section is essentially requires all buildings in this cohort to have a very formal O&M program. It includes a great deal of detail. It's got some layers to it that I've highlighted here. So 6.3 talks about the operations and maintenance implementation, meaning how do you create your list of things to do? And it directs you to normative Annex L. Now remember, normative means that that annex is part of the standard, it's required work. Normative Annex L essentially tells folks to create a custom plan for each building. Gives you guidance, tells you, what the scope is, but it also understands that all buildings are different. They're all going to have their own list of things to do, and that it's the work of the energy manager and their team to develop that list of things. Now, it's also supported by Standard 180, which is the HVAC maintenance standard, which is incredibly detailed, sets of schedules on how to maintain stuff. That's not part of the standard necessarily, but it certainly sets some expectations for us. And then also, when we get down to 6.4 operations and maintenance task, this is an informative annex. Once again, not required, but setting some expectations for a pretty high level of detail. So as you read through the standard, you also need to understand how these normative and informative annexes work. Think through what the requirements are really asking folks to do here. So I pulled the headings out of the normative Annex L, and as you can see, it's who's responsible, the building owner. It's the program incorporate, inventory of what items are to be inspected and maintained, maintenance plan, performance objectives. That's likely one of the most important parts of what we're doing here. Let's do stuff that counts, saves energy. How do you know something's working correctly or not. What's your condition indicator that says this thing's operating as it should? Your inspections and maintenance task, and then the frequencies of the task. Now, this is just, in this particular format, it's just an outline that the building owner is going to have to fill in for their particular property. But then we get to our informative work, and you see the very specific expectations that start to get set up through this standard. This is just the paragraphs on domestic hot water. And they have very specific instructions included there, the things you would put into your plan if it applies to your building. And then that reference to standard 180 leads you to, here's a list of tasks, here's what the task is, and here's the frequency of the task. Now, these things can all be modified by the building owner. There's also a procedure for how you determine how frequent you do things. You've been to this item and you checked it 5 times in the last year and it never seems to be much of anything wrong with it. Perhaps you can change your frequency. Things like that. That's outlined in our standard. This is just good operations and maintenance procedures. But we want to have some recognition that folks are doing this work, because it does lead to better efficiency in the operations of your facilities. So once again, I ask the question, we're going to have to create administrative structures in order to be able to determine if folks are doing this work, if they're doing it well, if it's meaningful. So we'll be working, providing additional information on the, what this might look like, but we're looking for input from folks on the best way to get this work done. So that's the extent of my presentation. A few minutes early, right? Or am I late? I don't know how I'm doing on my schedule. So we have some online questions. Paul's going to shout them out.
Yeah, we have one question. Can you provide a bit more detail on section 6.5 tenant improvements and their impacts on the EUI? That's from Tony Isabelli.
Well, so without looking it up, basically it says that a building owner needs to have a clear, I'll call it a set of protocols for new tenants when they move in, or to move in with meeting energy efficiency standards in mind. Aaron, I'm going to call on you to find that in the book. I'm fumbling here. So the section is, I think I can find it here. Probably, is that tenant improvements? Thank you. Yes, please.
Okay, 6.5 tenant improvements. The energy manager shall put in place a formal process to ensure that any tenant improvements involving a change in space use or the relocation of partitions, including partial height partitions, do not change the annual net energy use, except to the extent that the annual net energy use change, increase or decrease, is consistent with any change in the building's energy target.
All I'm going to say about that is that's where we start. If folks have specific comments on what that ought to look like, let us know.
So I'm sorry, I just keep asking questions. Nicholas Garcia will put again. If there was a change in use, such as you have a sort of a commercial building and out moved a, I don't know, a H&R Block sort of accounting space and in moved a hot yoga place, obviously their energy use is going to go up because they're going to keep it at much higher temperature. Is Is there going to be a ability to do that? Because the sound from the language is that your overall energy use can't go up, and yet just the general type of use is going to change enough that it could but not go up in that the scenario I'm giving.
Um, I don't have an answer for you today. Good observation. We have a comment from the audience.
I don't know. That's
Please say your name.
I'm Beth Robinweiler from PSC. That's not quite how I interpreted it. I interpreted it to say that if you do change the building usage, it needs to then align with the target for that building type. That's the way I've interpreted it. So.
I think that's right. So your building is broken up into a number of use types. Each use type has its own EUI. Now, I doubt hot yoga studio is called out in the standard as a specific use type, but that's a fair example. At any rate, all right, I'm going to turn the mic to Emily, who's going to try and start some conversations here.
Can I just,
Paul has one. Okay, well, let's do some Q&A for a few
right.
more minutes.
just I think I know the answer to this, but an energy manager could be funded by a utility or could work for an ESCO or for a city. There is nothing that says a building owner needs to have their own energy manager.
The energy manager is designated by the building.
Okay.
But I don't know that we care who pays them.
And maybe just an additional question on that, can a single energy manager be an energy manager for multiple buildings? Like thinking of a school district, for example, like it doesn't necessarily have to be a one person per each building and that person is unique to that building.
I think that's true, yes.
I think that really connects to Nicholas's question earlier on in the discussion is what are the opportunities for capacity sharing and really providing the support that we need to comply with the standard. So I think that's a great point, and I just wanted to make that connection. We've got a lot of opportunity there, and we'd love to hear your ideas.
Paul has somebody online.
Yeah, a question from Jim White. On the difficulties in applying this, one of the difficulties in applying this standard will be that individual buildings may not be metered or sub-metered. One utility meter could serve multiple buildings. So the question is this: does this law require that buildings be sub-metered?
So where we're starting is that you either can have end-use metering, allows you to establish an EY for the building, or you automatically go into the energy audit and improvement protocols in section 8 and 9. That's as currently written. And as we discussed a little earlier about campuses and such, I'm certainly willing to entertain other viable ways to generate an EUI for a building. That's a very difficult problem. I'm going to have to see some good recommendations on how to solve that problem.
All right, we are going to take a 5-minute break, and I have one request is that we don't use this door to leave in and out while we're doing the meetings, but the back door is kept open and you can walk in and out, and that way we don't get the door slamming. Thank you, guys.
was Nicholas from Waputa. He didn't even know about it until I sent him the information yesterday. I can't hear.
What we're going to ask you to do right now is to lift your gaze and to think big picture with this law, clean building standard. We really would like to get some input from you all about what are the priority topics we need to be talking about. So what is on your mind? What do we need to lean into with discussion? Chuck started his presentation with what we think are some of the primary rulemaking subjects, but there's a lot of other stuff that's going to come up for you. Some of the stuff is going to come up outside of the context of rulemaking, and that's okay. Let's gather that universe of ideas and topics that you want to talk more about, learn more about, and explore further. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask that you break up into small groups and just brainstorm what those topics are. We have flip charts spaced around the room. We're going to ask that you just turn your chairs, get into small groups, and you have sticky notes. Anybody have sticky notes here that I can? That table has sticky notes. Okay. What you're going to do is you're going to brainstorm all those ideas and you're going to put them on sticky notes and stick that onto the flip chart paper. After we get all the ideas onto the paper, we're going to take some time to do prioritization. Okay, so that's why sticky notes are helpful, because we can rearrange and move things around. We clear on what we're doing? Brainstorm topics, write them on the sticky notes, and get them on your flip charts. Work small groups, and we'll give you about 10 or 15 minutes or until the conversation lulls. Questions? Go.
So what we're going to do is we will have, I see you sorting this way. I see you guys over here working your way to the back. There's one in there, so we'll bring you guys back there. By Jake there, they are going to work around that one there. So we'll flip you guys around to work there. This is not for the people in the room, but for those online. You can submit your areas of concern and have them prioritized and send them to Emily's email. Thank you. For those online, we will be muting the room.
That's carbon in process. We also have a second concern around communications, like really on point for, and to make sure that we do our best to get them in. A number of building specific issues, issues that have been described here already, like using sub-meters that are non-revenue meters. We've had that data. So systems that are really issues. How to handle campuses and unmetered buildings, how to load issues. And then incentives are another of ours. Like, how do we make sure that sort of equity in terms of access to those incentives, defining the system and making it clear, proportioning of the incentives. Yeah. Seems
All right, thanks for that, everybody. Remote participants, we heard your comments as well. You want to talk more about exemptions, determination of unique loads, single metered campuses, partially occupied buildings, multiple occupancies, historically listed buildings, and two other topics that we have already mentioned. So just want to know we've got your input and it has been heard. It is lunchtime. We went just a couple minutes over, so we're going to reconvene at 12:20. Does that work? 30 minutes for lunch. Thank you, everybody. Lynn, can you hear us?
Okay, great. So I am Rebecca Baker and I work for the Seattle Office of Sustainability and Environment. And I'm also joined here today by a couple other folks from our office. Blake Ringheisen works with me on the Building Tune-Up program, and Christine Bunch, who also works in our office, Sustainability and Environment. We also have partners in Seattle City Light. We're all one family that are here today too. But thanks for inviting me to be here. I'm going to be sharing more about our Building Tune-Ups program. I'm not talking a lot about our benchmarking program, but if questions come up, let me know. I'm also the program manager for benchmarking and happy to share more at a later date if it makes sense. But wanting to just call out that as a program, we have been in place for the last couple of years. I'm going to be sharing some of the nuts and bolts of what the tune-up requirement is, but also trying to highlight some of our implementation methods that we use as far as administering the program. Blake, who's here with me, is our technical assistance advisor. So he is here. He's also the main point person when folks have questions. He also reviews the submittals and also is the point person for sending out the approvals. So he's here as well and will help answer questions. Today I'm going to go over a little bit of the program overview, give you some of our background, also give you the nuts and bolts of the tune-up itself, and share some of our tools and resources. So starting off with what the tune-up program is. The tune-up program, the law was actually passed in March of 2016. And similar to what the state's done, we actually started with the ordinance and then moved into about a 1.5 year rulemaking period to really define the details of how people would comply. So similarly, we worked with stakeholders to develop the actual elements of the tune-up. We worked with a technical advisory working group, really wanted to get the perspective of owners and experts in the field. And with that, we developed our director's rule that really guides the implementation phase of the law. So Seattle Building Tune-Ups. Tune-ups are operational and maintenance improvements. It's similar to the O&M requirements that the state law will have. There are a lot of parallels between them. They typically generate 10 to 15% energy savings. And for most advanced or highly performing buildings, these are already built into the regular maintenance of that facility. There are also a lot of facilities that don't do this on a regular basis. So the tune-ups policy is designed to help create and manage an efficient building, really looking for areas that we're wasting energy in our buildings, and really acknowledging the fact that every building has operation and maintenance issues. It's just a living scenario of a building that constantly needs to be tuned, just like your car. It's something that you need to pay attention to and regularly tune. Why are we mandating them? So of course, we're looking for carbon savings as well. It's geared to reach our carbon neutrality goals, and we recognize that the building sector is a huge contributor for us. 32% of our emissions in Seattle come from buildings. And we track our change in energy use in our building sector, and we know that we haven't hit our goals and are not on a trajectory to hit our goals. We specifically note that the commercial sector needs a little more boost. That's where the tune-ups came online. And we really wanted a policy that would give us near-term savings. So, I would say different than an audit that may actually plan for future, the tune-up is requiring specific work to be done now in the goal of getting savings in the near term. And also having a program that is really low cost and something that building owners can implement and learn from. So who needs to comply? This regulation, unlike our benchmarking regulation, is just a subset of those buildings. It's the commercial buildings, 50,000 square feet or greater. We do exclude parking when we determine if the building needs to comply. But once it's in the group that needs to comply, The tune-up spaces are required to be tuned as part of that compliance step. Tune-ups are required every 5 years. And we started with our own buildings. So in order for us to lead by example, the majority of the city-owned buildings, the largest buildings, had to comply 1 year in advance. And that really was helpful for us to not only save money and save energy in our own buildings, help us meet our goals, but it also helped us generate lessons learned so that we could improve the program, so that when we were working with the private sector, we had some of those kinks worked out. So the tune-up process. This is a quick overview of the tune-up process. Wanting to emphasize a couple things in that in order for you to do the work of a tune-up, it really does take time. We've heard this from the vendor community and building owner community, just recognizing that not just identifying when you need to comply with the city, but you really need to be starting back far enough so that you can indeed hire a tune-up specialist, either have that be someone on staff, have them build that into their work plan, or work with a vendor, perhaps developing the funding to be able to hire an external vendor. You need to have time to get into the building to do the actual assessment. That might take some coordination with getting into tenant spaces. Having a tune-up specialist do the assessment to identify voluntary and corrective and required corrective actions, and I'll get into that in a little bit. Next is also implementing and acting on those required corrective actions. Those need to be completed. That work needs to be done on site in the building, and it needs to be verified by the tune-up specialist that it was done properly. And the last step is submitting the summary data to us, the city. So this is a quick at a glance schedule, similar to the way that the state is embarking on a phased in approach. We are phasing in buildings by size. Our largest cohort of buildings, that first group, 200,000 square feet or greater, those were the first buildings that were acquired. And then we drop down in size each year. Again, just emphasizing that the cycle starts over again every 5 years. So tune-up specialist qualifications, just calling out that in our director's role, we identified who would be qualified to do this work. Again, we worked with the technical working group to figure out what level of expertise are we looking for, who should be able to do this work. We wanted to provide a variety of pathways, knowing that there are many different folks in the energy efficiency sector, wanting to recognize that there are a variety of existing certification programs out there. But we wanted to start first with years of experience, the 7 years of experience. It can be either education and or working experience. It does need to be focused on building efficiency work. And then specifically having one of the following of these certification programs. And you'll see quite a variety in this list. That's on purpose. We recognize that many people take different pathways. Having a professional engineer, PE, remind me again, the two that are, it's mechanical and architectural, are the two that we allow. So not just any PE, but mechanical or architectural. They also need to be certified within Washington State to do the work. So the other certification options, some of them do have required ongoing education credits. The certifications need to be current, and we do check for that information. Sure.
Yeah, I was just curious if building owners have had any trouble finding tune-up specialists. Has that come up at all?
We've heard people who may ask us, where do we start? We don't know where to begin. Actually, the Northwest Energy Efficiency Council has on their website a list of providers that meet the tune-up certification or tune-up specialist qualifications. So we typically point them there so that they can see the types of firms or individuals that offer services. Part of why we phased in the requirement was also so that it wouldn't overwhelm the market. It's roughly about 200 buildings a year that need to comply. And we've seen a lot of organizations that didn't have a local presence here in Seattle have moved into the Seattle area. So it's definitely drawing firms to open up offices here locally.
So, quick question about the certification requirements. As I'm assuming that the building type that's going to have to go through the certification, the square foot is going to slowly come down over time. Do you see that a smaller building, perhaps less sophisticated, could have a inspector who's not as educated, not as capable, not instead of 7 years experience, 3 years or something like that? Or I'm just curious how you will handle that as the size of buildings that need to comply change.
That's a good question. So in order to do the work, they do need to have a qualified tune-up specialist. So they would need to have 7 years of experience. We would not allow someone to do the work that only has 3 years of experience. That being said, if you have, let's say, a firm where there's one entity that does meet that qualification and there are other folks within the firm that are contributing to the work, as long as that work is overseen by someone who is a qualified tune-up specialist, they can engage in the practice of conducting the tune-up. So we've seen a lot of that happen even within on-site staff. So some of the elements, when we get into the detail of the elements, it'll become more apparent. But some of the work that would be required may be implemented by on-site maintenance staff. So not all of the actual implementation of the required corrective actions needs to be done by a tune-up specialist. They can work with in-house staff to complete that oversight body, making sure it's completed. One other thing I'll note, I don't have any slides on this, but for the smaller scale buildings, as you mentioned, as you get smaller, they're going to be less on-site managed, oftentimes have a very different pattern of ownership than the larger scale buildings. We actually received a grant from the Department of Energy and ran an accelerator program in partnership with Seattle City Light. And that program was geared towards buildings under 100,000 square feet. And we created this incentive program so that they could comply in advance. So similar to the incentive program that the state is standing up or will be standing up. So it was encouraging those buildings to comply in advance. And in complying in advance, they were able to receive incentive funding. So we had over 100 buildings that participated in that program. And it was geared towards those smaller buildings because we recognize that those are different. They're very different ownership and management. And we wanted to learn from that sector as well. What does a tune-up involve? As that diagram showed earlier, the first step is conducting a building assessment. And I'm calling out that this assessment needs to be done on site, boots in the building, to identify the operational and maintenance deficiencies. They also are required to review the benchmarking data, do some billing analysis of energy and water bills. That work is done up front to identify the required corrective actions. And I have some handouts in the back of the room that I want to encourage you to take a look at on your way out. In the owner's guide, it highlights all of the different elements that need to be assessed. And part of the way that the program was set up is that the person who's doing the assessment, the building tune-up specialist, while they're on site, they're going to notice a lot of what's happening in the building. Half of the value is having that information provided to the facility manager or the building owner. So identifying voluntary corrective actions as you're doing an assessment of the HVAC system, there are many things that you're going to see. Some we require be fixed. We tried to focus on those that had the biggest bang for their buck, those that would give us the most energy savings. But we also wanted the owner to have the information about other measures that would also save them money and save them energy. And many times we're seeing that building owners are just acting on those because they're easy to implement or they're planning for them in the future. So the next is, as I mentioned, implementing those required corrective actions and then verifying that those changes were made correctly. So how do I achieve compliance? This is something that Chuck encouraged me to share a little more about. So we do have a summary report that's required to be submitted. So there is documentation that you need to provide. We actually have created an Excel workbook that folks can use to gather data on site. We had heard from many vendors that being able to have something to collect the information when they're walking through the building would be helpful. Not everybody uses that. Some people use their own tools. But knowing that they could be in a basement with no Wi-Fi, having something that they could download to their computer or tablet, collect that information while they're on the site. We, in the meantime, we're building an online portal so that the information can be submitted to the city. If there are folks in here in the room that are using Seattle Services Portal for permitting processes, we use that same system to submit the information to the city. So the other piece is that we require that you share that information with the building owner. Again, the emphasis is that the building owner has learning from this information, that they're getting a sense of what's going on in their building. Ideally, tune-ups are done more than every 5 years. So we encourage them to take an adoptive process, just like the state rule will require that there be an ongoing O&M practice. So lastly, it's submitted for compliance review. Blake's going to take a look at what you submit. The tool itself allows for some back and forth. There can be corrections required. Certain pieces of the tune-up can be opened up so that additional information can be added or clarified. And then we're able to, through a workflow process, approve that once it's met all the requirements. So here's just a quick snapshot of that Seattle Services Portal. It's a one-stop shop for where the city has many different regulatory programs. You can see building tune-ups here at the first stage. Those are all the different modules. People register for an account in this system. They can move on to the tune-ups piece. They can save their records. If you're a vendor, you may have many tune-ups that you're doing for all different building owners. And it also provides help and assistance and shows you how to actually navigate the tool. So this is a quick snapshot of the actual portal. We do everything within the system. We actually do have a claim a building process that makes sure that you're reporting the building that is required to comply. It also makes sure that the information that you're providing us is accessible to those who you allow access to that information. Since it's an online portal, unlike permitting, we don't expose all that information. You're providing a lot of detail about the systems in your building. So having a claim a building process provides a threshold of which you can assign who gets to see that information. That was important for us and important for building owners that there be some information that's provided that's just not able to be Googled, let's say. Now, that being said, public agency, we could get a request for disclosure and all that information has to come out, but it's not available for just anyone to look up and see how old your furnace is. The next is registering as a tune-up specialist. As I mentioned, we do require folks to register so that we can approve them. That's required. You won't, if you submit all the information to us and you're not a qualified tune-up specialist, we would reject that submission. So it's important to do that up front. Yeah, the portal won't let you proceed unless you have a approved tune-up specialist. So there's some built-in measures already in the online tool. Good point, Blake. We also have folks who pursue alternative compliance can do it through the system or requesting waiver extension not subject to the rule. And if they're folks who are unlucky and get a notice of violation, they can appeal through here. So violations, I wanted just to throw it in here that there are penalties for non-compliance. We have a first penalty that was meant to be a lower threshold to encourage compliance. We recognize that tune-ups take time. We actually have the due date of the tune-up, but then provide another 180 days before we actually assess the fine. That gives folks time if they are coming up with and finding issues in their building, because all buildings are going to be different. Some are going to have a lot, some are going to have a little. Provides a little buffer of time to complete that work. The second penalty amount is obviously very large, and that's intended to dissuade folks from just paying fines. We want them to do the tune-up work. We want the savings for ourselves as a city and for the building owner themselves. Tune-up work. Okay. So tune-up focus areas, I'm going to get a little more detailed here. So these are the areas that the tune-up covers: the HVAC system, the lighting system and controls, domestic hot water, water use in building envelope. This entire program, I would just want to give a nod to Pacific Northwest National Labs, that their research in their retuning program was the emphasis for how to develop this approach. We also borrowed a lot from New York City's program. So just making a note that their work in buildings and doing tune-up work, they actually have great information available online as to the savings that they were able to uncover in buildings based on their research and their actual implementation of tune-ups. This is a quick summary of all the measures, and we located along here, actually Blake did this, cross-referenced, crosswalked them with our requirements. So the numbers that you see, the letters and numbers that you see next to each of the measures relates to our requirement. So we were building on that research when trying to figure out which elements should we require and which elements should be voluntary. Over time, I think as we learn from what we're seeing, who's submitting what, we may we may start to migrate some of our voluntary, make them required. Who knows? May add in new things, but as a starting point, we used PNNL's research quite heavily. Okay, so tune-ups, observation and data-driven. We worked actually with Smart Building Center on doing some of our early education to building tune-up specialists, highlighting again that observation, doing that walkthrough. You're looking at all these different systems, both the operations and the maintenance side of things. And then you're also looking at data, wherever you can gather data from the building to help influence and identify where there are issues in the building. The initial data collection, threw in here an example of the workbook. This is some of the upfront information that you do provide in completing a tune-up. The workbook itself has a number of different tabs, and that's where the information can be submitted. As I mentioned, we have the online portal, which is what you need to ultimately use to submit to the city. Now we're getting into all the specific elements. A couple things I wanted to call out here is that, as I mentioned, there's the required versus voluntary. All elements need to be assessed and recommendations made regardless of whether or not it's required or voluntary. But the HVAC assessment elements are obviously the ones that are the most extensive. I think it's something like 11 are required out of 18. You get a sense of the type of work that is involved in a tune-up. So looking at scheduling, looking at set points, making sure that set points have been adjusted appropriately for the use in the building, making sure that filters have been changed, that there are no clogs, that the equipment's in good condition, functioning. One of the things that we use to explain tune-up work is that you're trying to make sure what is there is functioning as best as possible. So we don't require is that you get a new HVAC system. It's not a capital measure in that, if I just define it in that way. But replacing small parts within your system so that it functions, that's required as part of a tune-up. So there's a fine line there, but we're trying to work with what we have and make sure it's working as efficiently as possible. We have these lighting assessment elements. You can see here that there are 4 that are assessed, just 1 is required. Domestic hot water, 2, and both are required. Water usage assessment elements, here there are a number here, but the number that are required are just a subset. Examples are things like recommending repair if the scope is more than standard maintenance. So again, you may come across major leaks that need to be repaired. You may come across piping that is failing for an entire system, or that it makes sense that if the state that system is in, you're recommending that they plan for full replacement. Envelope assessment elements are the last piece. These are also items that are assessed. None of them are required unless it is standard maintenance. So let's say you come across a hole that just makes sense that if you have a hole in your roof that you should repair that. And surprisingly, sometimes these things come up through the assessment. So again, just highlighting the required versus voluntary corrective actions, highlighting the difference between those two. And I also always try to highlight the fact that you can use the in-house staff. So making sure that that's actually the best way to do it is that you're working hand in hand with the facility manager when doing the assessment work, even if you are hiring an out-of-house vendor to do that work. You want to share that knowledge so that carries forward with the folks who are working day to day with the building. Here's an example of our workbook, and it shows you where you're collecting information. In these different tabs, you get a sense of, it's a pretty high level summary of what you found there that you submit to the city. And there are elements that, sections that are required to be completed. Depends on whether or not it was a required corrective element or voluntary. Again, highlighting that a recommendation still needs to be made on the voluntary, but implementation is voluntary. Here are some examples. This gives you an example of the level of detail that we would expect to see submitted. So this example is assessment element E2, review HVAC set points. There was a deficiency observed, corrections required. You have to let us know when you're submitting the summary if it was done. And then you provide a description of the work that was done. Here's an example of a voluntary corrective action, inefficient lighting. And in this case, the work was done, even though it wasn't required. So we see some of this, and this is great. It's kind of like a stretch code. We wanted a little more than what we're actually requiring, and we're getting some of it sometimes. And then last is another voluntary corrective action example that is one that wasn't implemented, but the owner is now aware. So the other thing that we like to call out is that assessment sampling is permitted. You're allowed to do a sample if there's repetitive or identical equipment. It does depend on size, whether or not the number, or that's depending on size, dictates the amount and number that you must assess. So 12% of identical equipment in larger buildings, no more than 10 in buildings 50 to 99,999 square feet, and no fewer than 20 in buildings 100,000 square feet or greater. These are some of the common deficiencies observed to date. Just giving you an example, and also trying to normalize the fact that buildings have issues. They are exposed through this process. We see it in our own buildings, and that this is part of the normal process of maintaining a building. And so you can see, here are some of the ones that we traditionally see. We also have in the back of the room a case study that was based on city buildings. We share what we found in our own buildings. What we've heard from tune-up specialists is that sometimes the facility manager is embarrassed that things come up. We're really trying to remove that stigma. It doesn't mean that they weren't doing their job. This is just work. It's hard to do operations and maintenance work when you're competing for many other projects. It's hard to have it happen on a regular basis, for it to happen all at one point. The tune-up regulation does require you to do it all at one point. And issues will be uncovered, and they are easy to correct. Last is just giving some of our highlights of success. We've reached 88% compliance for our largest buildings, and I think there are many people in this room that have contributed to that, so I thank you for your efforts and your work. 96 tune-ups conducted in this cohort. We actually have over 300 tune-ups that have been conducted either through the accelerator program or cohort 2 as well. But we're really thrilled with the participation rate. Very few buildings were fined. Tools and resources is the last couple slides. Just highlighting that there's a lot of information on our website for you to take a look at. Our resources is where you're going to find all our handout information. And we also have the help desk, as I mentioned. We also have a couple of newsletters that we communicate with building owners and also tune-up specialists. We have a lot of supporting materials. As I mentioned, I brought a few here. We have an overview sheet. We have a FAQ sheet. We have the building owner's guide. And then we have 2 case studies, one on the Seattle Justice Center and one on the common measures. So we encourage you to take a look at those today. It gives you a good example of how to stand up a program and the level of information that people will be looking for. I'm ready for questions.
Just a couple like detailed questions. So how many tune-up specialists do you have registered in your program now for that many buildings?
Around about 80 or 90, I believe. Probably more out there that haven't registered yet, but that's like the pool that we've been.
You may have covered this and I just missed it, but one thing I've noticed in buildings I've been in is that you have a wide degree of differences between tolerance for heat and cold. And so you have people bringing in their own personal heaters or their own personal fans to make their particular space more comfortable for them. How does this interact with that, if it does?
Tune-up specialist makes a recommendation of what's an acceptable building owner have some specific reason for that. So place would explain but things like personal heaters and coolers, those are not directly addressed in the tune-up. A specialist might recommend around that.
Say that also might be an indicator that they've got a bigger issue if they're seeing a lot of that in spaces that perhaps there are some balancing issues that need to be addressed. That could be an indicator, but there's nothing that bans that as part of our tune-up. Obviously, overall performance, that would probably show up. So for the state requirement, that might become something that people focus on.
Have you guys done any kind of like cost analysis on how much does it cost from a resource perspective and financially to do the tune-up and go through the process from kind of start to finish, ballparks?
Some of those numbers are in the case study. The center costs for doing the assessment portion of the tune-up and required and some voluntary corrective action. Also seen quite a bit of cost data from accelerator buildings, the smaller buildings that accelerator. And I believe the cost was somewhere on the order of 4 to 29 cents a square foot. That includes
the 88% compliance rate is really great. So I hate to pick on the 12%, but I'm just wondering if you see any common characteristics amongst the buildings in the 12%.
Repeat the question, please. We're not always
Okay. The question was not to diminish the 88% compliance, but the 12% that didn't comply. Was there any kind of pattern? There was actually a little bit of a pattern. There were building owners that had multiple buildings that fell into that bucket. So it was only, I think, 4 owners. And of that group, majority are underway with the tune-up. They just weren't finished. So I think the pattern of some starting late showed up in the enforcement numbers. There are only 3 buildings that I know of that we don't well, actually one started a tune-up, just hasn't finished. I don't know if they're going to finish. And then one owner owns 2 buildings and I don't think they're planning to comply. So that's pretty amazing out of 182 buildings, our largest buildings in the city. So we're pretty pleased.
Did I remember correctly that, what did you say, 186 of the larger buildings? But there were not 88% of those. I did not see the number of tune-ups as 88% of that number of buildings. Did they, were they in compliance? Some other, how, do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Okay.
So what she's calling out is that 88% compliance includes buildings that didn't do a tune-up. And we have alternative compliance pathways available for building owners that have high-performing buildings. And so oftentimes the alternative compliance pathways are efforts that equate to going above and beyond a tune-up. So one of the pathways, for instance, is ongoing commissioning. So that is actually doing more measuring and responding in real time. So it's as though you're doing an ongoing tune-up. That was one of the pathways, as well as having an Energy Star score greater than 90 for the largest buildings. Other measures included doing a full ASHRAE Level 2 audit and implementing all measures that had a payback of 3 years or less. That was another compliance pathway. So we were trying to reward those high-performing buildings by providing that off-ramp. Were some other options as well. You could qualify for a waiver for a whole cycle, depending on if the building was undergoing redevelopment. That was one of those substantial alterations. So in a scenario where a substantial alteration, what we mean by that is it's qualified by SDCI in that way, and it would be triggering the energy code, which would be much more aggressive. So
This is from Sarah Moore online. Is the city collecting and planning on distributing data in tune-up outcomes?
the city is collecting the summary reports, as I mentioned earlier, and we will be doing analysis of preliminary findings in 2020 and reporting back to council on what we're seeing. We'll also, as we receive more and more tune-ups, telling where were people finding those corrective actions, what were those patterns, and we'll also be tracking changes in building energy use. The timeline for seeing the energy changes is a little longer, obviously. If tune-ups are due this last year when they were due, we really need to see at least another whole 12 months of data before we're actually going to be able to take a assessment from that angle. But I think this next year in 2020, we'll be able to share back with the community what are some of the key findings. So, thank you.
Rebecca, Blake, thank you for that. All right, we are going to take a 5-minute break, but before we break, there are a number of burning questions that you all have that have not yet come into the space of conversation. Feel free to put those on a sticky note, put them up here, and we're happy to address them before we part ways today. If we can't address them, we'll at least acknowledge we received them and we don't have a good answer for them. But feel free to put questions up here. We will reconvene at 1:10. Okay. Thank you. All right, are we ready to get rolling? It's Friday. Let's get this. Let's do this. All right, calling everybody back to your seats. All right, it's Friday. You all have been very generous with your time, input, and good ideas. We have one more workshop discussion. We're hoping that you can provide some input for the process. So we started our day, Chuck gave us a presentation on sections 5 and 6 of ASHRAE Standard 100, energy management plan, operations and maintenance plan. We just got some great examples from the city of Seattle about what they're doing here with their tune-up program. What we would love to hear from you is what is the quote unquote right level of documentation needed for compliance with the energy management plan and operations and maintenance plan? We want to have documentation where we're balancing thoroughness and alignment with the intent behind the legislation, but yet not creating a system that's so overly administratively burdensome. That was a lot of words. That's not so burdensome that it's difficult to comply with. We would love to get your input on that. We're looking for documentation that's sufficient, not overly burdensome, but yet is clear and actionable. We're all entering this conversation from very different places. Some of you might have really specific recommendations about how we might approach that. Some of you might have recommendations that are focused more on just principles for how we would set up criteria for that. So let's start the conversation in a big open-ended brainstorm. Provide as much specific information as you want or broader guiding principles. You may have examples of other programs, you might have specific recommendations, or you might want to point us to a tool that you know is out there that would be really helpful, again, for compliance with that energy management plan, operations and maintenance plan. Anything you want to add, Chuck? Was that a good setup? Reasonable setup? How are utility programs doing? Tell us about that. We got a lot of utilities in the room. Okay, we're going to ask you break up into small groups again. We've got the flip charts out there. Just cluster around a flip chart that's close to you, and we'll give you 15 minutes or so for discussion until we hear the conversation lull. And we are going to ask that each group has one person report out. Good? Thank you. All right, let's start to wrap up. Thank you. One more minute to wrap up. Are we ready? Reporters. We're going to go the other way around the room. You ready? No. Going clockwise, not counterclockwise. Thank you.
I'm Elizabeth. I'm from ZGF Architects. We talked about a lot of different things. I'm just going to go through them. We were kind of all over the place. We talked about how especially small utilities or small building owners are going to need some really clear guidance, and a one-pager would be ideal for the actual documentation in all cases, but that having some sort of longer data collection or kind of guidance document would be good. It's kind of like a document that the city of Seattle has for benchmarking. We talked about who's responsible for the documentation, how that's probably the energy manager, but in small kind of rural areas, that might be, one person for a lot of different buildings, and that might be complicated for building owners to keep. Talked a lot about how there are going to be accredited professionals who are signing off on this, and maybe the documentation itself can be fairly light because they know what they're doing, and maybe they just get audited, a certain percentage of the time, and we kind of trust them doing. General for the documentation, maybe use Energy Star kind of system or that already exists. Talked a lot about needing to have guidance because people might.
We talked about a lot of other stuff. And, but one of the things that came out for me was to have documentation so that, for example, if a building does not meet its target, how is the documentation going to show that they are actually in progress towards meeting it? So stepping back from that. And then we did talk about things, I'll just say, having some sort of documentation or communication between the utilities and commerce. How do they coordinate? And then having judgment at the field level by the energy manager or the auditor, and decreasing paperwork that way. I'm not sure if that quite. And definitely having carbon savings. So documentation measures, estimated savings, carbon savings, the savings investment ratio, et cetera. And the timing. We didn't talk about what the timing should be, but need to have consideration for timing.
Brett did it last time. Let's see. So we had allowing for documentation of, say, an energy management plan to span across multiple buildings. For example, like in a school district where they've got the same approach to building operations, just allowing some mechanism where you just upload that document one time versus for each individual building. Also talked about consider portfolio customers that may have like a 5 to 10 year capital improvement plan. Yeah, it just aligns with alignment of compliance reporting between state and local jurisdictions. Like locally here, if there's a site that's subject to the Seattle tune-up ordinance, are they reporting a lot of the same information to places? Or also jurisdictionally, like across the United States, if there's lots of customers who have buildings in Washington State, but also other places, and the number of different jurisdictions that you're having to report to. And then talked about the administrative process for changing the use of your building and kind of what the timeline is for that to be effective, especially when there's frequent changes in use of a building.
And we talked about a lot of the same stuff has been discussed, but we also talked about whether or not the reporting should be simpler than what the tune-up policy requires. So more of a checklist approach so that minimizes the burden of reporting on the building owners and energy managers. Talked about whether or not Commerce should use audit process, and probably should, and sampling to verify that all of the different components of the energy plan and benchmarking were all done for each year. We talked about the challenge that annual requirements around benchmarking and execution sense when there's a 5-year reporting requirement, and whether or not they should have to report all 5 years worth of energy data and all 5 years worth of O&M plans. We talked about whether or not they should, there should be a document uploading process in advance where you demonstrate that you've done all the work, allows Commerce to more easily audit the actual energy management plans and benchmarking data. Talked about variabilities in data quality and the challenge that verifying benchmarking data.
Everyone. Emily, what's on your list?
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for the great discussion. We have one question on our burning questions list. Chuck, are tribal facilities covered? You want to noodle on that one? We don't know. Clearly an area we need to explore. Who else has a burning question? Christine. Yeah. I can start talking a little bit. So who's in charge? I mean, my response to that would be of what? I mentioned that WSU Energy Program is going to be playing a critical role in customer support and technical assistance. Who's in charge of commerce? Like Chuck and I are joint decision makers, and ultimately we're really looking to get input from you all about the process and how we shape it up. What do you want to add to that?
Well, I was thinking of the question more broadly. Yeah. Well, so the Department of Commerce is ultimately responsible for how Commerce develops a program that be responsive and make the sorts of adjustments necessary. We have to figure that out. Hopefully we can, based on the experiences we've seen in local government, anticipate some of those issues and address them before the rule is done. There is also required that we develop appeals processes and implement them as well. So there are some consideration for addressing things.
Any other questions?
So the law specifies that Commerce is supposed to identify hiring an individual project on. Okay, well, and identify all the buildings through that process. Some county data is better than others. Taking it all from a list. We'll err to notifying people that maybe don't need to comply and allow them to, send us a postcard or something that says, our building's not that big or whatever the.
What is the timeline for you to identify buildings fall under this? And then my second question is, a little bit of information linking to Department of but you're only going to find that if you happen to.
Yeah, there's a lot of competing stuff out there, isn't there? I put out a broad press release, had a little action on it, not much. We will notify buildings as we identify them, but we have a deadline in the statute. Not mistaken, it's in there. We're going to drive hard to hit that date. A little ways before that. Oh, yes, we can. And particularly all the utilities. Yes, you can be very helpful.
So maybe we could, 2021's a ways out there. So I don't know, maybe we could just have that as those of us who have it.
Yeah,
Appreciate that.
can I add exactly that, plus not just the utilities, but everyone to tell anyone who might have an interest in this and link them to the Commerce website. That's how people hear and it spreads around.
Any more comments, questions? Are we still on burning questions?
I think we've sizzled out. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and close things out here today. I do have one last ask of you on those sticky notes on the tables. If you have feedback for us about how the meeting went for you, what went well, what didn't go well, or how you want to see things unfold in the future, that is your ticket out the door. So I've got a flip chart back there that says meeting number 1 with a plus and a delta. So what worked well for you, put it under the plus column. What didn't work well for you, under the delta triangle column. We chose Seattle as a meeting location because it's centrally located, and we have a whole bunch of conversations lined up here in the coming weeks. So we welcome your feedback on how to best increase access for folks to participate in the conversation. So let us know your thoughts on that. There is a sign-up sheet at the back of the room. If you didn't sign in on your way in today, please sign in on your way out so we can have record of folks that participated. Today's meeting really was a first step in the process. It was an open and broad conversation, and we are really grateful for your active participation and willingness to share your thoughts. So thank you so much. We got a lot of input from you on priorities over there behind Chuck, and we'll use this input to feed into how we structure future agenda items. So this was immensely helpful and will be used in the future. Want to provide a reminder to watch the webinar that's now posted on the building's webpage. Chuck delivered that back on October 30th, and it's a really nice overview of the law itself. So do watch that if you haven't already. Austin's going to tell us a bit more how to comment as we move forward in the process. Before I hand over the mic, I wanted to say thank you to the Smart Building Center for hosting us. Thank you, Rebecca and Blake, for presenting. Chuck, Austin, Paul, you're amazing, and thank you for everything you did. And every one of you, thanks for coming today. We really appreciate the conversation.
Yes, to echo what Emily said, thank you guys for attending and for bringing your thoughts. Moving forward, there's a few things that I want to make clear. The website will be updated this weekend, containing the agenda information here. We appreciate your attendance and driving, people to that webpage. I don't know if Chuck knows, but Glenn and him are in a competition over whose page gets the most visits between the buildings and CETA. So he'd appreciate you visiting the site as often as possible. Yes, it does. It does count. So we also would appreciate feedback that you have taking away from this meeting and sending that in a written form to our email address at the Clean Buildings. Is it Clean Buildings? Buildings at commerce.wa.gov. And I was thinking we could get that, if we could get that feedback in the next 2 weeks, that'd be appreciated. We have one meeting that overlaps with that time. But I was thinking the 22nd. Does that sound good? High level guiding principles, program examples that you guys have, recommendations, priorities that you want to reiterate, tool recommendations, anything high level you want to get out. We are going to be diving deep into each of these areas, so there will be a lot of time to comment and dive even deeper on these topics, areas of concern for you all. So just appreciate you guys showing up today, and hope you have a great weekend.